Hey everybody, welcome to week 13. Man, this semester is cruising right by. We've just got a couple of weeks left and then we'll be done with this semester, have a break for Christmas, and then get into the next semester, which I'll be talking about those classes probably next week, what I've got lined up for spring semester. So for this week, I want to talk a bit more to begin about Islam. I know a lot of you found quite fascinating the idea of dogs in Islam in the last video. I mean, who would have thought that's how it would work out? Cats are okay, dogs are not okay when it comes to Islam. It's such an interesting delineation that they make in that is so interesting. So the question that was kind of a big question that we talked a lot about this week, and I think we're going to talk a bit more about next week, is where did radical Islam come from? So if you followed the videos that I've done, we know that Islam grew, turned into a big, went from a religion into a nation. They basically kind of became a country of their own as they dominated over the Persian and Byzantine empires, and then the Mongols came through and almost wiped them out. They were just so thorough in pushing through that area. And then when the Mongols left, what was left of Islam came back, and I mean they were there basically, but just being ruled by the Mongol Empire. And so when they left, Islam now could come back in as a government entity, and that was the birth of the Ottoman Empire as one of the what we've called them the gunpowder empires, because they learned quickly how to use gunpowder. Then the Safavid Empire, which is over in the Iran area, Kazakhstan, that area today. And then the Mughal Empire, which was kind of the Muslim remnant of the Mongol Empire that went down into India. Not to mention, as the trade routes started to spread and emerge through Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Islam continued to flourish and adjust over there. So after the Ottoman Empire has been a really interesting one. If you've ever studied World War I, you've probably heard about the Ottoman Empire. It was an empire that was around about that time and then quickly went away after that 1920s time period. It was already quite in decline by then, anyways. Through the 1800s, Ottoman Empire, and late 1700s through the 1800s, Ottoman Empire started to drop off. So the Ottomans was an interesting empire. I'd heard that name, Ottoman Empire, a lot, but I hadn't really thought about it. Just because U.S. history doesn't get into the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire was born out of these Turkish groups. Now, when I say Turkish, you're probably thinking, oh, people from Turkey. Well, actually, they originate from Central Asia. They go over for Anatolia, Central Asia area, and then they migrated into what we would call present-day Turkey, which was a main part of the Ottoman Empire. In a way, Turkey's kind of what's left over from the Ottoman Empire to an extent, because it was a big empire. It covered quite a bit of area. Well, so the Ottoman Empire is a Turkish-ran empire. Now, they are Muslim, but they're not Arab Muslim. And so this was where there's a distinction that starts to happen. The Ottoman Empire often used Sufism, so the mystic Sufism, the ones that are out spinning and dancing and doing really interesting things. They were usually the front of Islam as they went into new countries to expand and grow, and then they ran into Sunni Islam, which was what the Ottoman Empire predominantly was, which is the main theme or main version of Islam since Muhammad's time, since that first great succession period after Muhammad. So that was the Ottoman Empire. Now here's a couple challenges the Ottoman Empire ran into. One, they're not Arab Muslims, they're Turkish Muslims. And so the Arab Muslims are like, well, you're not the original Muslims. Original Muslims are Arab Muslims, not Turkish Muslims. You were converted later. The other challenge that Ottoman Empire ran into eventually was Britain and France, as well as the Netherlands and Dutch and all these groups. As Europe emerged, the Ottoman Empire was no longer much of a threat to them. Through some of the wars, Russia was a big threat, and they kind of encouraged Ottoman to help them to take care of those. We talked about that last week a little bit. So the Ottoman Empire is now dealing directly with commerce and other issues in diplomatic issues and things with Europe. And so this concept of westernization is a common theme through the 17 and 1800s. You see, as Britain and France and these other countries are flourishing, trying to expand their empire, they do what's called the East India Trade Company. That was part of England. You've probably heard about that if you ever watched, I think it's the third Pirates of the Caribbean movie, is the East India Trading Company. So this company, it was a corporation that came around, and it was basically overseeing. It was like the corporate entity that was sponsored by the British government to oversee British interests in the Indian Ocean and that area of the country over there, all the trade routes and those kinds of things. And the problem was, is it turned into a little bit of an oligarchy type, little its own little country to an extent. And Britain's like, hey, you can't do that. We own you, so we're gonna kick you out. And then England takes over. So that's how England's getting into India and in those areas over there as well. So British rule, imperialism, Westernism is coming into India, which they run into the Mughal Empire down there. As also the Ottoman Empire is running into them up around the Mediterranean. Um, so a lot of things are happening, okay, in the 17 and 1800s. So as Europe is finally hitting their stride, England and the British Empire is growing, expanding. France is expanding. France owns land in America. France is fighting for parts of India and other places as well. There's a lot of competing interests and things that are happening at this time. And as far as Islam is concerned, the Ottoman Empire is trying to work with this westernization. So the Ottoman Empire starts to westernize a little bit. Some of the Ottoman Empire doesn't want to westernize at all. They see it as destroying Islam, whereas others are like, no, we need to play along and work well with our neighbors. And that contrast starts to build divisions in the Ottoman Empire. So as these divisions grow, people start to say, well, we think, you're Turkish Arabs, or Turkish Muslims, not Arab Muslims. So Arab Muslims are more true Muslims. You're not a true Muslim. And you're starting to westernize things and distort the Quran and other issues. And so we're going to kind of take back our religion. So there were small factions that start to rebel against the Ottoman Empire. One of them we learned about is the Wahhabist movement. Wahhabism is a version of Islam, basically, if you will, kind of a different flavor of Islam. Just like in Protestantism, you have evangelicals and you've got Baptists and Lutherans and others. It's kind of like one of those breaking off from the main group of Christianity to do their own little version of Christianity. Wahhabism comes into play at this point, and they're pretty fundamentalist. They're down in the Saudi Arabia area in that desert. So more original location for Islam. They have a long heritage of living Islam down there as well. And because Mecca and Medina and those places are there also. They start to decide that, we're kind of sick of the Ottomans running and controlling us. So as the Ottoman Empire is facing issues with Russia and Britain and other things, Egypt starts to try to come in and actually take out the Ottoman Empire at one point. And so there's all these challenges. And so Egypt ends up getting suppressed by Britain because Britain is backing the Ottoman Empire for the encouraging westernization. So Egypt gets subdued. And so there's all this stuff that's going on. This Wahhabist group starts to form in Saudi Arabia. They start to emerge as a powerful group because they start getting a lot of these Arab tribes pulled together. They're all kind of loosely tied, loosely connected all through the Arab area in the Saudi Arabian peninsula and all that area in the Middle East. So they start to gather these groups together, and all these little fringe groups, like some of the Shia groups and others that the Sunni Ottomans don't like, they start to come together with this Wahhabist group. And they form a pretty strong resistance against the Ottoman Empire. So they're like, we're kicking all the Ottomans out of our country. We're going to declare the Saudi desert area, our land, our country, all the Ottomans are considered infidels and get kicked out. If you're an Ottoman, if you're Sunni, you're out. And so they try to push them out. Actually, they didn't kick out Sunnis. It was more Shias that actually got kicked out because they were part of it. They were more of a Sunni tribe, excuse me. Um, but all these other groups, if you're non-Muslim, you're out. Get out. We're going to kind of purify our area. And so there was a lot of massacres and kicking these other groups out that took place. I think it was around like 1802 that took place, somewhere around there, 1805 sometime. But anyways, they grow. They're a very fundamentalist group. Now, over all these centuries that has been going on as Islam has grown and had to adapt itself to governing a whole lot of land mass area, dealing with different religions and pluralism and different countries and other things like that, there has developed over time four major schools of thought in Islam. And so like Hanbali and some of the other ones, there's these four major ways of thinking or ways of interpreting Islam and understanding Islamic law. Well, Wahhabism says we're going to get rid of all that. We're just going to go back to the Quran and just go back and fundamentally start with that and just go be more originalistic. Now, here's part of the problem. Being originalistic to Islam kind of means living in a desert, in hard, arid climates, not having a lot of technology and modernization, and kind of living in archaic times. They chose to, in a way, from a modern perspective, go backwards as far as like progressives and modernism and ideas. They went backwards on purpose because it was more fundamental to their religion to go back to the days of Muhammad. So instead of emerging as Europe was emerging with modernism and things, they went back to the 600s instead of the stayed in the 1800s. So they got this radicalized them. They were very extreme. Now, they actually tried to conquer Egypt, and Egypt pushed them back, and then Britain came in, and actually there's another radical group that built up there, and Britain had to come in and wipe them out too. So several of these got wiped out. Wahhabism, actually, the first two iterations of Wahhabism, those groups that were emerging, end up getting destroyed by England. I think it was England that took down both of them. The third one eventually emerged in the mid to late 1800s and stuck. They did not get destroyed. England was no longer as much of an empire. Their empire was in that area had been lost. They'd been pushed out of a lot of those areas, and were just becoming more of just a country. You know, they had already fought in America and lost all that land as well in the late 1700s, and so England was shrinking to just the British Isles, basically, instead of this huge British Empire. So Wahhabism didn't face a lot of enemies at the time, and they ended up taking over Saudi Arabia. Now you might think, well, that's really interesting, but what happened to them if that was in the 1800s? Wahhabism is where the Saudi family comes from. I think we're going to get more understanding some of those ties next week. But that's where they came from. They started from this fundamentalist kind of extremist group that really went back to the old ways of doing things in Islam, and they ended up establishing themselves a nation that emerged as a country who then discovered oil and became Saudi Arabia today. So that's where they came from. This time period, as Wahhabism is doing this, there's lots of these small factions that are starting to pull up. So Wahhabism starts a new movement in Islam where Islam isn't just a religion, it isn't just a possible government entity, it's a political movement within governments. And it comes in and starts to take over. So other groups start to do this as well. This emerges Islam with politics. They start to come together where Islam can now not just come in with an army and dominate another country, but they can come into a country as a political movement and then dominate the country and take it over. So Islam mixes with politics in the 1800s. That is the beginning of the radicalization of what we have today. That's where it started from. So it's not very old. It's 1800s time frame. most of it really comes from. But that's where it starts to stir together and move. The Ottoman Empire was one of the last great Muslim empires in the area, and then it kind of fell apart. Uh, Saudi Arabia is kind of the next in line as far as major countries that are Muslim at the time. And always keep in mind, this is we're talking about the Middle East area. Most Muslims today actually live in Indonesia. There's more Muslims in Indonesia than in the Middle East. And so when you think of, even though we usually think of Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia as the main home center of Islam, most Islams live in Indonesia and over in that area of the world. It spread faster. It was more flexible and adaptable to the other religions and ideas that were over there at the time, and so it survived much better. And so a lot of Islam is from over there, not Middle East. Middle East is where you get a mix of good Islamic rules and ideas. People who are just trying to be good Muslims, aren't trying to hurt anybody, aren't trying to cause problems for any other country. They are jumbled in with the extremist groups that see Islam as an excuse and opportunity to further their political agendas and to push into other places and do more things. So like this Wahhabis, when they were first out, they justified the massacring of people who were Sunni because, or not Sunni, but Ottomans, the Turkish groups, because they said, oh, you're not really Muslim. Now, even though the Quran actually says you should treat your neighbors well, you shouldn't try to go kill people, basically that's a bad idea, they interpreted and justified themselves through their interpretation of the Quran to say, well, but there's other parts of the scriptures that talk about infidels and going against the true religion, and we think you're going against it, therefore we're going after you. So their perspective, even though they were accusing the Ottomans of not being Islamic enough, they, in a sense, defied what most people would have thought of Islam at the time. And so they thought they were right, but they just created an extreme faction that was just as extreme away from Islam as maybe the Ottoman Empire was perceived by them to be. And that's where the problems have been beginning for what we still have today with some of the radical Islam groups that are out there. I mean, there's been some changes and evolutions since then. We're going to talk about those most likely next week. But it's just interesting how this has worked out. So imperialism did a lot to push down and subdue Islamic growth through different parts of the world, as well as fundamentalists who want to go back to more original ways of believing and living in Islam. They went backwards and lost a lot of progress in their countries because of that. And so that's where there's these different disconnects that we see today because of that. So stay tuned. We're going to have more on Islam as we get going. For my mediation class, a lot of what we're doing is preparing for our final mediation. So next week, I've got a big pre-mediation for an hour to do, for 2 hours actually to do. We're going to have our teacher and their assistant are going to be our couple that is in conflict. And so we have to do pre-mediation with them for an hour each. Next Tuesday, we'll do the pre-mediation, and pre-mediation is where we're understanding where they're coming from, talking with them, discussing things with them, understand, what is of value to them, what is their worldview like, what happened, what are the perspectives and ideas, how can we help them see themselves as part of the conflict. So always remember, whenever there's a conflict, when you're in conflict with somebody else, you're part of the problem. And I don't mean that as you're guilty. What I mean that is both of you are guilty. You are contributing at some level to the conflict. You may not have started the conflict, but maybe how you responded to the conflict is not helping the conflict to resolve. Maybe it's perpetuating the conflict. So it's important that when you get in conflict, to first take some time and think, what am I doing to contribute to the continuation of this conflict? What is it the other person needs, and how can I be a help for them to get that? Those are important questions to be asking. So that's what pre-mediation is about, is to help them understand their pattern and their problems their responsibilities in the conflict. Then the week after that will be our final week, and then that's when we actually do the final mediation. My partner and I are going to go in and mediate the two of them together and see what we can do in an hour to help them out. There's no guarantee it gets resolved in an hour. Oftentimes it can take a couple hours to get a resolution, but our teacher just wants us mainly to see how do we use the tools we've been learning in class to do things, basically, which will be fun. It'll be a good experience to go through. So some interesting ideas and concepts as we're really applying everything together in mediation to look at how can we see the other as human? How do we recognize we are in the same boat together? What happens to you is going to affect me. How do we work together to understand what's going on with this conflict and how to get out of this pattern of conflict and help each other out to grow and improve? So that's what transformative mediation is all about. All right, so let me get to my paper, my research paper. It's gone in a whole different direction, like I talked about last week. It's still using some of the research that I've been doing, but I've had to really focus it down. A lot of the feedback I've been given has been it's still too broad. You're trying to talk about too many things at once. You need to really narrow it down even further. So I've narrowed it down to what's called the Mormon Question. The Mormon Question is this concept that it really emerged in the late 1800s in America, where people were wondering about Mormonism and polygamy. What's this deal with polygamy? Why are you practicing this? It's against the law, don't you know? Why are you violating that? You're in the 1890, the president of the church at the time put out a manifesto to stop practicing it. Why are you still practicing it? What's going on with all this? And this really came to a head for America during the Reed-Smoot trials trial in around 1906. Kathleen Flake has written a phenomenal book. And I'm trying to remember the name of it right off the top of my head, but if you just Google or even go to Amazon and Kathleen Flake Reed-Smoot trial, and you can find her book, it is fascinating to see what happens. They actually got Joseph F. Smith, the prophet, in Congress on the witness stand for like 3 whole days and grilled him about church policies and practices and polygamy and things. And because of that, he started to realize we needed to standardize the practices of the church to understand it and make sure we don't have these fringe ideas and things out there. He actually released a second manifesto, and that second manifesto made it excommunicatable to practice polygamy. So if anybody practice polygamy, you're kicked out of the church because of Joseph F. Smith. But he put that idea in place of we need to standardize the church, which is why we got a church handbook around 1920. That was the first church handbook, so it's just a little over 20 years or 100 years old, basically. And that's when the church started to be more central and organized in what it was doing. Basically, rather than a bunch of organizations working together, it centralized itself and changed some things, got rid of some old practices and standardized other practices and things, which was good for a growing church. So all that's because, like, through the Reed-Smoot trial and stuff, this big Mormon question. Well, in England, this Mormon question made it over there. In England, the Mormon question was, if polygamy is being practiced in America, that must mean the Mormon missionaries in England are here to convince girls to convert to Mormonism and then move to Utah to be put into polygamous relationships. They're sucking the single good women out of England and moving them to Utah for these polygamous relationships. That was what was the rumor that was spread. It started around late 1800s and went all into the 1900s. And didn't really die down too much until almost the 1930s. So almost beginning of World War II, and the Great Depression era and times like that, when it started to really, all the anti-Mormon stuff started to really die off. But it was pretty hot and heavy for a while there. It was pretty crazy getting into some of the things that were happening with the people. So what's fascinating is around 1910 and 1911 and into 1912, there were 8 different times where members of Parliament asked the Home Office, who Home Office in England is kind of an equivalent to Secretary of State in America, somebody who's their job to kind of run the country, be the main person to administrate a lot of stuff for the country. Um, and so they went to the Home Office and said, "Hey, are you aware of these Mormons and these rumors that they're convincing our women to leave and go to Utah for polygamous relationships? Are you doing anything about this?" Well, interesting enough, around this time, the Home Office leader was Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill ended up, after these parliamentary queries started to come into him, he started an investigation into what were going on with these Mormon missionaries. And he went out and started to find out, how did these Mormon missionaries, what are they doing? Are they actually legitimately taking women, or are they not? And so he talked to police constables who were dealing with other local complaints. He talked with other groups in the area. He looked for correspondence and information, looked at immigration records of who was leaving England to go to America. Even reached out to America to talk about this and confirm, is polygamy actually still being practiced over there? And they're like, nope, it's not being practiced anymore. They got rid of it. It's gone. So all this was happening. And this investigation further encouraged the anti-Mormon movement to get worse. One of the ways it got worse was there was a woman, her pen name was Winifred Graham. I don't remember her actual name off the top of my head, but her pen name was Winifred Graham. She wrote like 18 or something books. These were called sixpenny books. They're kind of a short, quick, easy read books, like 150-page type novels. She wrote like 8 or 9 books that were anti-Mormon. Most of them were about polygamy. One of them that came out in 1911 was, oh, I just forgot the name of it. It's like right there. But anyways, it was very salacious. It basically talked about, there was this elder missionary who was very charismatic and hypnotic, and he would go around and find, you know, single beautiful women, and he would kind of use his charisma to get them to interact with him and get them to swoon to him and just think he's amazing and wonderful. And then he would get them baptized and then start moving them out of England and get them to Utah for polygamous relationships. And if you're familiar with Bram Stoker's Dracula, the book, you'll probably notice some similar themes in Winifred Graham's book, because there's a scholar I found that actually says they believe they have evidence to show that Winifred Graham actually used different symbols and types of ideas and concepts that Bram Stoker's used in writing Dracula, and that's how she patterned the missionary after Dracula, and patterned the fair maidens Dracula was going after for these women in being suckered into Mormonism. In 1922, there was a movie adaptation of her book called "Trapped by the Mormons." You can actually find it. I'm actually watching it on YouTube. It was free, just "Trapped by the Mormons," and you'll find it on YouTube. It's a silent film. But it's like I says, if you're familiar with Bram Stoker's Dracula, you'll be like, wait, there's a lot of similarities of cinematography and things here. That's really interesting. So anyways, like they were destroying the people. Like the investigation was really thorough. Some of the people in Parliament were trying to push back against, like they wanted laws against the Mormons in Britain. They started pointing to Germany. Now, over in Germany, around 1903, they actually did kick out a bunch of LDS missionaries from Prussia. And then again, I think around 1910, 1911 or something like that, they kicked out a few more, like 21 more. And the reason they did that, it wasn't the German government kicking them out. It was local police authorities that were saying, you're out of here. We're not going to deal with you guys. Claiming some disturbances of the peace, some of the issues, the things they were teaching wasn't working well and causing a stir among the people. And so they got rid of them. So they were still in the rest of Germany, but just not in the Prussia area. And so some of the parliamentary members in England were like, well, they kicked them out. Can't we do that in our country? And Winston Churchill's like, That was a police action. That we don't have that kind of power at the governmental level here to do that. Germany's a different country. They use different laws. So it's really interesting how he contrasts that. They couldn't kick the Mormons out because of laws in England. So those laws are the things that I'm studying to show how did these laws that England had influence that investigation and how that investigation turned out. So stay tuned for more as I continue doing this research and pulling that together, and we'll see you next week, and we'll talk more about that fun research I'm doing. See you then.